Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And now, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the beginnings of Japan's war in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Now, in the past, you might have heard me refer to Japan 1941 by Eri Hotta, which is a really good book, a very insightful study of Japanese decision making in the run up to Pearl Harbor. But one point that Eri Hotta and a number of academics on the subject make is that by and large, unlike Germany, when the German people heard of the news of Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939, when there was widespread worry and apathy, in 1941 there was quite a broad feeling of enthusiasm for Japan's war in the Pacific, and particularly the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Why? Well, there had been several years of economic crisis in Japan, particularly from American oil and scrap metal embargoes and other sanctions following that had been ongoing for at least 12 months. And the overall sense that Japanese writers and correspondents have of the big cities, Tokyo, Nagasaki and Yokohama, these kinds of places, was that the Japanese people were becoming tired and hungry, and that breaking out of this stranglehold on Japan was vital. Now, looking at history from a Japanese perspective, confrontation with European powers or the United States of America had been a possibility since perhaps the 1860s. The 1840s to the 1860s had seen much of Asia fall under European control, and only the Meiji Restoration and the swift modernization of Japan seem to have saved Japan from that fate. And so it came as little surprise that after a brief period of cooperation from 1902 to the 1920s with Britain, France and then later America, that this should suddenly be come to an end, and a more natural state of affairs of hostility and a sense of siege, so the 1930s and 40s, should ensue. If you add to this some complicated nationalist and imperialist and yet sort of anti-imperialist politics that saw Japan as the shining light of Asia that would liberate the rest of Asia from Europeans and create a kind of commonwealth of Asian nations led by Japan, where Japan would show the way. Japan was proud of its ability to have been avoided colonization, to resist colonization, and could lead the way for the rest of Asia, kind of like a Pan-Asian anti-colonialism. That was the kind of the liberal strand of thought, but it was combined with a more militarist, toxic, and chauvinistic imperialism, which sought simply to replace European colonizers with an even more predatory and violent Japanese version. These are the ingredients that by late 1941 mean that a powerful factor in making war inevitable was there, i.e. broad public consent for conflict. So Max Hastings writes, "Many Japanese welcomed the war, which they believed offered their country its only honourable escape from beleaguerment. Novelist Osamu Dazai, for instance, was itching to beat up the bestial, insensitive Americans to a pulp. But it would be mistaken to imagine Osamu's society as a monolith. Lieutenant General Kuribashi Tademichi, who spent 2 years in the United States, wrote to his wife asserting his strong opposition to challenging so mighty a foe on the battlefield. Its industrial potential is huge, and its people are energetic and versatile. one must never underestimate the Americans' fighting ability. 18-year-old Hachiro Sasaki mused his diary, "How many really died tragic deaths in this war? I am sure that there are more comical deaths under the disguise of tragic deaths. Comical deaths involve no joy of life, but are filled with agony without any meaning or value." Hachiro, at an early stage, resigned himself to his own extinction and volunteered as a pilot with an almost explicit determination to satisfy fate, as indeed he did. His disdain for Japanese militarists never faded. He persuaded his younger brother to become a science student with immunity from conscription so that he, at least, might survive. The core motivation of Japan's war against European powers in Asia and the Pacific, however, can be understood when you look at the title for the plan that the Japanese High Command drew up in the middle of 1941. It's called the Operational Plan for Ending the War with the US, Britain, the Netherlands and Chiang Kai-shek. Now, at this point, Japan is only at war with one of those powers, Chiang Kai-shek, or nationalist China. And the main objective was to seize the resources of Southeast Asia and the Pacific to finally marshal them in order to break the power of the nationalists and the communists in China and end the Chinese War. The Chinese War, much like Hitler's war in Russia, would either be won successfully and create a vast empire in China, or it would draw Japan in and grind Japan down. Japan, like Germany, a militaristic nation that had few minimal resources of its own, couldn't sustain long campaigns. And one of the key realizations of the Allied powers during the war was that they could outlast their enemies. The plan relied on waiting for a good opportunity in the European war, so perhaps the fall of Britain and the the victory of Hitler in the Soviet Union, and using this opportunity to seize Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, and wage war across the Pacific, destroying American naval power in a series of set-piece battles. India was a big question in the minds of Japanese military planners. It seems that the most likely strategy was to train the Indian National Army under Subhas Chandra Bose. Now, if you haven't learned about Bose before, there's a podcast, isn't it? Must be 3 years ago now. And using nationalist anti-British forces, march them back into India, defeat the British or wage a long enough campaign to incite a revolution or an uprising against the British. If this coincided with the loss of the Suez Canal, the Germans in North Africa seizing it, then the chances of hanging on to India would be almost nil, and that would be the end of British power in Asia. Much has been said over the years about Japanese policy towards Australia. It seems more and more likely a consensus, mainly of Australian military historians, now seem to be more and more certain that Japan had few plans to land an army in Australia. Perhaps the sheer size of Australia made that impossible. But the Japanese did look on Australia as being strategically very, very important. What the Japanese were aware of was that Australia could act as a huge marshalling yard for American forces to take back Asia, much as Britain was a staging post for an invasion of mainland Europe. And therefore, instead of pouring hundreds of thousands of troops into Australia and trying to control a continent too vast to even conceive of controlling, what the Japanese chose to do instead was to seize the islands on the sea routes to Australia that they could build air bases on and submarine bases on, and cut off the sea lanes, thus surrounding and strangling Australia into some kind of submission, or making it almost impossible to land a significant force of troops there. And this is why so much fighting will be done in New Guinea and the Marshall Islands and the Solomon Islands, to which we will come in the not too distant future. When Emperor Hirohito studied the plan, he said, "I understand you are going to do Hong Kong after Malaya starts. Well, what about the foreign concessions in China?" Hirohito was assured that European properties would also be seized. The government in Tokyo was disappointed in its hopes of delaying a declaration of war until Germany's victory in the West was complete. Obviously, Germany's victory in the West never fully comes. There was the belief that Britain would indeed collapse, and that becomes an impossibility after the success of the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. And this miscalculation was typical of Japan, the rigidity of the thinking of Japan's generals, and the inability to read correctly British intentions and the course of events in Europe in general. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the naval commander-in-chief, assumed that the Americans would be no pushover. Yamamoto deviated from a very popular idea in Japan that American society had become corrupted and lazy and unable to take the necessary risks and hardships, and decadent, if you will, and that the martial warrior spirit of the Japanese would triumph over this. Yamamoto was under no such illusions. Neither was his colleague Nagumo, who led the task force against Pearl Harbor. In 1940, the Japanese had marched into French Indochina. They had placed immense pressure on Vichy France to allow Japanese troops to occupy at least part of the Indochinese colony. One of the reasons why the Japanese were keen to seize Indochina is that it was, firstly, an ideal route into China itself that they could cut off and prevent supplies from nationalist and Chinese diasporas into China to aid Chiang Kai-shek's resistance to Japanese conquest. Burma would also be a way of Japan plugging the flow of equipment and munitions into China as well. But also, the Japanese were rather keen on seizing a deep water bay at Cam Ranh, from which most of the Japanese naval offensives and amphibious landings against Malaya and Singapore were launched. The scale of ambition of Japan's generals of seizing territory from Burma all the way to a few hundred miles off the tip of Australia, from the Aleutian Islands all the way down to the mid-Pacific, was partly due to a kind of like an ambition arms race between two services. The Japanese army were hoping that perhaps the government would not commit them to an invasion of the Philippines. However, Japan's naval commanders convinced the army that there was going to be no way around it, and that the Philippines, an American protectorate, would have to be conquered, because otherwise it would be a staging post for a strike back against the Japanese Empire. So the different ambitions of the different services of the Japanese Empire and the different strategic priorities, all based around the conquest of China, meant that there could be virtually no part of Southeast Asia that was off the table. And so, in order to solve the China problem, the scale of operations had to grow and grow and grow. Of course, any empire that grows at such an exponentially rapid rate is at risk of dramatic overstretch. And by the time you get to 1944 and Japan's final battles with the British and the Indian Army on the borders of India, you start to really see this empire under serious strain, and with pretty catastrophic results for the Japanese in the end. The planners in Tokyo set about devising a series of what they called swift thrusts that would overrun weak defences in Malaya, Burma, the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. And they were right in assuming that the defences, particularly in Malaya and Burma, were very weak. If you read Forgotten Armies by Tim Harper and Christopher Bailey, one of the points they make there is that the level of effort and investment gone into defending Malaya was fairly weak. The British saw these parts of the world as useful for generating lots of income from things like rubber and opium as well. However, the ability of an overstretched British Empire to adequately pay for their defences, and the lack of efficient and highly talented imperial administrators and soldiers, an entire generation of who died at the Battle of the Somme, meant that the lowest calibre of imperial administrator managed to prevail by default. The Japanese assumption that the British had become decadent and weak wasn't wildly far of the mark. Japan's militarists, writes Max Hastings, their calculations were mired in conceit and fatalism, a belief in shikata ga nai, it cannot be helped, is the translation, an ignorance of the world outside Asia. The shikata ga nai really means that, well, war is coming whether one would like it or not, so you might as well get on with it and win it. Japan's soldiers would prove themselves to be some of the toughest and most durable soldiers of the war, and had a deep sense of duty and a willingness to sacrifice, not just sacrifice their lives, but to live in immense hardship in order to see victory through. But they seem to have been aided far more so by the weaknesses and the mistakes of their opponents. Just as Britain's war in Europe against Hitler ranges in 1940 from the farcical to the tragic, with occasional moments of heroism, so the war against the Japanese in Asia in 1941 and 1942 has a similar kind of quality about it, inept and leadership, particularly when you look at the fall of Singapore and the terrible decisions made by General Percival. But the assumption that guided the Japanese particularly was that America would eventually give up the fight in Asia. And this had to happen because Japanese industry just could not outproduce the United States. It didn't have the scientific base to do so, and it didn't have the economy to do so. And Germany and Japan, unlike Britain and America, never coordinated their activities in any meaningful way, and they had little common ground and little kind of interest and few shared values, other than a desire to see the Allied powers defeated. Yamamoto's hope was that a raid on Pearl Harbor would destroy the US Pacific Fleet, and most importantly the US Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, and that the destruction of that and the fuel dumps on Pearl Harbor would make an eventual invasion of Hawaii inevitable. This, and perhaps even bombing raids on the west coast of America, would make Americans realise that the Pacific was unconquerable and had fallen into the Japanese sphere of influence, and convince Americans that it was more important to give up and come to some kind of sensible peace arrangement. The point at which this idea falls down is mass production. The US Navy would be able to replace any losses very, very quickly, and to bring a war far beyond the scope of anything Japan could possibly cope with. The problem at Pearl Harbor, as we shall see, was that the 4 carriers of the US Pacific Fleet aren't there, and the Pacific War, fought over huge distances, would be a carrier war, not a battleship war. It may have been wiser for the Axis powers to have coordinated their war against Stalin, being as the Japanese had fought a border war against Stalin in late 1939, late summer 1939 at Khalkhin Gol, and had a war being fought by both Japan and Nazi Germany in 1941 at the same time. Stalin would not have been able to release his Siberian divisions, and Moscow would have fallen. The principal reason why the US and Britain agreed on a Germany first policy was that the successes of Japan in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia were all, in the eyes of Churchill and Roosevelt, temporary. Horrifying and shameful, yes, but temporary. And they could certainly be easily reversed once Hitler was defeated. But the ability of Hitler to cause chaos in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for a certain period of time in 1941 and 1942 places almost unbearable strains on Britain's ability to keep the British Empire functioning. Okay, so we're going to talk more about Japan, quite a considerable amount more, in the next few podcasts. But thanks for listening, and we'll be doing a little bit more on Italy and the Treaty of Versailles later today. As you all know, we're funded through a little trickle of ad revenue and the kindness and largesse of our patrons. So if you can check out our Patreon page and sponsor the Explaining History podcast, we can keep going, and I'll be very grateful. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.